Here's a system that, without your knowledge, took all that personal information to use it against you, to make you conform to a political idea.
Der Einblick in die Akte zum ersten Mal.
Looking into the files for the first time makes you shudder. To suspect is one thing. To see it in black and white, that's really serious.
The Stasi, secret police force of East German communism, largely consigned to history, you might think, more than 2 decades after the Berlin Wall fell. But the Stasi, with a staff of up to 90,000, plus another 190,000 informers, workers spying on colleagues, teachers on children, even husbands on wives, left behind an astonishing legacy still emerging today. I've been listening to some of the thousands of Stasi sound recordings now being rescued, ranging from attempts to bug flats to Stasi leaders struggling to comprehend the threat of the latest Western youth culture. And, as we'll hear, dramatic secret recordings of trials where the Stasi's enemies were condemned to death. And then there's the mountains of paper. Some files were intact, but the Stasi also left the remains of the documents they tried to destroy as they were expelled from power. I've been discovering how the most amazing human persistence and technical wizardry aims to reveal the secrets hidden in millions of paper shreds.
We are talking about 600 million of shreds, approximately 45 million pages.
So why is such a huge effort still being made to reconstruct the history of the Stasi? For me, it all begins with a journey back into the Cold War era. I'm still haunted by unanswered questions from my time living in Berlin as a student in the 1980s. I crossed the border regularly between west and east of what was then a divided city. And entering the east, I know I must have met the Stasi without knowing it. A museum's just opened where I used to cross at Friedrichstrasse station. And here's somewhere that really brings back the strongest memories. They've kept one of the cubicles that you used to have to go into when you were crossing the border, a really confined, claustrophobic space, and facing you, stony-faced border guards, and all around you mirrors from strange angles. And then there will be the questions, and it's not only the kind of information you'd expect, like name, passport number, that kind of thing, but where you were going, what you were planning to do, who you were going to see. And at certain times, they would take you to one side for a special extra interrogation. I remember once an extremely bizarre conversation with someone I assume was a Stasi officer going through my wallet, and the thing he was most interested in was a ticket for a cricket match, and we had this strange conversation for several minutes. I like to think perhaps somewhere in those Stasi archives there's a report on this imperialist game called cricket. And finally, if they decided to let you through, there'd be this click of the door as they released it, and through you came into the hallway in the Friedrichstrasse station, but still there was this sense of being watched all the time, even as the door clicked behind you.
State security was equal with fear, and therefore I came with friends here to stop their work or to say, come out and we don't want you anymore, we don't like you anymore. I don't know how to explain. It was a special atmosphere to that time.
So what happened to all that information the Stasi had obsessively gathered when the wall came down and the communist East German state, the GDR, collapsed? Barbara Timm, a young environmental activist who'd been spied on by the Stasi, joined thousands of demonstrators in January 1990 around the Normannenstrasse in Berlin. This was the HQ of the Ministry for State Security, where thousands of Stasi files were kept.
We knew that state security started up to destroy their materials. And I went into the streets to protest against the state.
In East Berlin, tens of thousands of people have stormed the security police headquarters.
I was very close to the gate here. We had a lot of demands. We wanted immediately closing of all Stasi facilities, Hausbahn for all the employees, and no more special payments and privilege for them. A little bit later we shouted, open the gate, open the gate.
The regular police, who are now officially in charge, made no effort to halt the invasion. But when the crowd reached the main doors, the mood turned more violent.
Did you have an idea then what you wanted to do? Did people want to go and find the files straight away, that kind of thing?
Also, I had no ideas what to do here inside. I just took part in the mass. They wanted to let us to an unimportant building because the archive it's in the other direction.
In the other direction, so they were diverting you the other way.
They led us to House 18. House 18 was a house for supply.
So what did you find in there?
But it was interesting to see their own hairdresser shop, to see a bookstore, to see the canteen, a supermarket, a travel agency, and yeah.
Inside, the crowd wandered freely along the corridors which were once the most secret in East Germany. Earlier today, the government had revealed that the annual budget for internal spying had been running at £1 billion a year, and that more than 2,000 people were employed simply to pry on personal mail.
Yeah, it was always the question what to do with all the files, also personal files or the other documents, and we had different kind of opinions. Some they said it's good to destroy all the files because we don't know what's happened after. Me too, I was afraid what will happen after the reunification with all our files, what the Western secret services are doing with the files. And for me, also, I was sure they will use the files once again against us.
You were worried that Western secret services would come and take files from here?
Yeah, yes.
Do you believe they did that?
Yes.
But whatever Western intelligence agencies may or may not have taken, for thousands of East Germans what mattered was the personal material in the files left behind. Intimate detail about lives, their lives.
Did you think that you might have a file?
Might. I knew. Also in my case exist just fragments. I haven't a complete file. I have, for example, one index card because I like to go to the French Cultural Center here in the near of the Brandenburger Gate to see the beautiful exhibitions. It was like a door to the world for me. And they start also an observation. Yeah.
So you discovered all this when you saw your file or the fragments in your file?
Yes, yes. And I worked in the Federal Commission for the Stasi Records, and one day suddenly I had in my hands an index card from one of my best friends. And yeah, a little bit later I knew that he spied on us, that he worked as an unofficial informer. Yeah, I don't know more what to say. It's he misused the trust of us, of me too, and...
Have you had contact with him about it?
No, I broke off the friendship.
There were some who said all the files were best destroyed or locked away in a closed archive. People feared the painful truths contained in them about who'd informed on whom. Others felt they just had to know. And in the end, a special federal authority was created and staffed at great expense to preserve, organise and make Stasi files available to individuals and approved researchers. More than 2 decades later, the authorities' offices in central Berlin are as busy as ever.
And last year alone we had 80,000 people requesting access to their files for personal reasons alone. This is the Lesesaal, the reading room.
Dagmar Hoverstedt from the Federal Authority took me into the room where individuals come to read their Stasi files. Privacy is very important. While the files may belong to the state, the information in them is seen as belonging to the individual.
And sometimes it can be gut-wrenching, heartbreaking stuff. It could be the betrayal of a friend. It could be that you find out it wasn't you or your inability that stopped you from getting, that job or your spot at the university. It was the Stasi who decided you shouldn't be accepted, and then you solve mysteries of your life and your career and the obstacles in your path. It's tremendous relief, but obviously betrayal is a tremendous burden and it hurts.
How much is family history important in all this? Precisely because the Stasi tried to infiltrate families and break up the loyalty of families very often, one can imagine that it's a very sensitive issue for many families. So is that all part of coming to see the records sometimes?
Interestingly enough, that is something that has only recently started to happen increasingly. It seemed to have taken about a generation after the fall of the wall, the unification of Germany, 20 years after opening these files for public access, that people think it's time to look into the family, where those that were part of the system, part maybe even of the Stasi, might be open to being questioned by their children or grandchildren, and where, like, the father who never spoke about the time where he was incarcerated in East Germany has now died, and the daughter says, I want to know what happened to him. What did they do? Why did he never want to go into a closed room? Why did he always sleep with an open door? And this type of questioning and this type of demand to access the files, we start to see happen increasingly now.
We move on to see the current head of the federal authority, Roland Jahn, who grew up in East Germany, was expelled by the Stasi as a political dissident, and then worked from West Berlin as a TV journalist, where the Stasi continued to spy on him.
Ich habe vieles gewusst und geahnt, was die Staatssicherheit gemacht hat.
I already knew and suspected much, but looking into the files for the first time makes you shudder. I felt how close to my life they really were, how they intruded into my life. And the really personal things. They'd drawn the layout of my flat in West Berlin, where all the furniture was, so I knew they'd been in there. And I saw how they'd drawn a sketch of my 8-year-old daughter's route to school. Then I knew, quite definitively, how the Stasi operated.
And now there's the prospect of many others being able to discover for the first time how the Stasi operated against them. The federal authorities facing its greatest challenge, reconstructing documents the Stasi tried to destroy just after the revolution against communism. Following the fall of the Berlin Wall, there was a strange period of limbo. Stasi officials, fearful of being prosecuted for their actions, did their best to destroy incriminating material. But that hasty destruction was only partly successful.
Mein Name ist Joachim Häusler.
Joachim Häusler is leading a project called Virtual Reconstruction of Stasi documents. He told me why the federal authority has been left with masses of hastily torn paper, 16,000 sackfuls.
Am 7. Oktober 1989 haben sie...
Things moved very quickly in 1989. You had the 40th anniversary of the GDR, then a month later there was no minister anymore responsible for state security. A month later some of the Stasi offices were already being occupied. So they didn't have very long to react. But this was an organisation that didn't really destroy paper very much. It loved to keep paper. So they actually didn't have very many shredders. And the ones they did have were a rather poor GDR production, so they broke down very quickly. They also tried a kind of chemical process to destroy it. And again, where they did that, there's nothing we can do with those. But that also was a system that could break down easily. You could have burnt the papers, but there were problems there depending on the kind of heating system you have. That might be dangerous too. So that's how you ended up with a lot of manual destruction, simply tearing these documents up by hand, and that's why we've ended up with all this paper in sacks.
Also wir haben eben das größte Puzzle der Welt.
So you're calling it the biggest puzzle in the world because you think you have between 400 and 600 million pieces of paper.
Yeah.
That's an astounding number.
Yeah.
Up to 600 million pieces.
Yeah.
Does that not feel quite depressing? Deprimierend?
No, nein, das ist nicht deprimierend. Man muss nur Wege finden, wie man das vernünftig verarbeitet. Ne?
You've just got to find ways of dealing with that, yes.
Until recently, the authority has been trying to reassemble painstakingly some of this torn material by hand with a small team based in Bavaria. But they've realised the sheer amount and variety of paper makes the task impossible for humans alone.
Faced with the fact that it was looking like taking centuries to get humans to piece together all these documents, the authorities asked others for ideas for help. There was one group that wanted to move all the sacks of fragments of paper over to Vietnam and get 1,000 Vietnamese to put them together. That was ruled out for legal and other reasons. But the people who won the bid are here at the Fraunhofer Institute in the west of Berlin, and they believe that computer technology is the answer.
After a cup of tea, it's time to find out a little more about how what they call their e-puzzler computer software works. In front of large screens, Henry Zoberbier began to explain how all the snippets of paper are processed.
We have to determine the features on the snippets. Very important.
The great attempt to solve the Stasi jigsaw puzzle works like this. Bits of torn paper of all shapes and sizes are taken out of the sacks, ironed flat, then scanned into a computer. Each piece, however small, is given a computer file into which is entered any information about, say, paper colour, handwriting or print on it, any significant acronyms that might link it to a particular Stasi department. Then a complex mathematical program is brought into action, matching that information and the paper's shape with other fragments from among the millions of snippets. Henry Zoberbier demonstrated how it would work.
Take one of these.
You're clicking now on one of these little fragments up on the screen.
Fragments and taking these features and looking for all snippets got the same
Now we've now got a list.
We got a list and therefore we checking the background color.
It's come up, it says 16 fragments have been found.
With similar color.
So now up are coming these 16 fragments on the screen, which have similar properties.
Yeah, and you take...
So this is the bit that looks a bit like an on-screen jigsaw puzzle. You're trying to move around the shapes initially here.
Something like that. And then we can give me all these snippets with handwriting on, similar handwriting to this one.
Now it says it's found 8 like that.
And now you can start the e-puzzler.
And the e-puzzler is the thing that fits them together?
Comparing the shape to build up a whole page.
So what we can actually see on the screen now, here is the original sheet with the marks where the tears were made. And presumably with some of the sheets, which were in tiny pieces, this whole process would take quite a lot longer.
A little bit longer, but it's possible. For human, won't be possible, for example.
All this may seem dry and technical, but the engineering brain behind the operation, Bertram Nikolay, is also a man with a broad sense of this project's place in German history, and a very personal reason too for wanting to reveal more about crimes the Stasi committed. He believes a close friend was killed by being exposed to radiation in a Stasi prison.
Jürgen Fuchs war ein Verfolgter in der DDR, der sich auch...
Jürgen Fuchs was persecuted in East Germany, in the GDR. He'd always been against the regime and was forced out of the GDR. I got to know him here in West Berlin. We were friends. But he died relatively young because of this exposure to radiation. So for me, that's a further motivation for this project.
And when you saw these reports about the attempt to reconstruct by hand these documents that the Stasi had tried to destroy, was your feeling, this is going to take too long if we just rely on humans to do it by hand?
Yes, when I saw this on TV, it was clear to me that this is an ideal project for the machine vision technology that my department specializes in. I immediately saw this as a great challenge.
Und für mich persönlich, weil ich das...
And for me, personally, having seen the fate of Jürgen Fuchs and several other people I've known who died as a result of this radiation, all this has moral and ethical parallels with the Nazi period. During the Nazi period, researchers worked on killing people with chemical means. Here they had people working on how a dose of radiation could kill people. I find it interesting discovering what happened, not in the sense of punishment and revenge, but if one could just discover who gave these kinds of orders.
Unseren Politikern, wenn die dieses Projekt nicht...
I've always said to our politicians who don't want to finance this, it's our history. The victims are still alive.
And still alive too are many who had senior roles in the Stasi, top jobs when East Germany was a confident Soviet ally in the Cold War era. But after the revolution in 1989, their prestige and confidence faded suddenly, and they've kept a low profile since, often shunning the media. However, one former Stasi colonel in counter-espionage, Gotthold Schramm, did agree to see me, cautiously arranging to meet, old habits die hard, in my hotel lobby, where he said he'd be carrying books under his arm. And he began by presenting me with his new book on the threat, as he sees it, posed by today's German secret services, too similar, it appears, to the West Germans he schemed against during the Cold War. Now a sprightly 80-year-old, he joined the Stasi in the 1950s and was personal assistant to Markus Wolf, head of its Foreign Intelligence Division. And when it comes to the Stasi's broader work, at home as well as abroad, he begins in unrepentant mood.
Das Hauptanliegen unserer Arbeit, da gehen wir keine...
The main aim of our work, and we didn't deviate 1 centimetre from that, especially in counterintelligence, was to preserve the peace, to stop the Cold War from becoming a hot war. In that respect, our work was honourable. I have nothing to regret. Current historical opinion is clearly guided by Western mainstream thinking. The view is that everything the East German Ministry of State Security and Foreign Intelligence did was criminal, that there were only victims. You can't judge history like that. You can't have collective guilt like that. Guilt is an individual thing.
But so many in the population felt themselves spied on. Do you not see that as something that was against human rights?
That belonged to our security policy. Looking back now, it was a matter of creating friends, not enemies. It wasn't necessary to create this great unofficial network of informers against the influences from outside. But the first leaders of the ministry were anti-fascists. They fought the Nazis. It's much easier to judge with hindsight. But in my opinion, with hindsight, we didn't need this giant network of collaborators. It involved too much work. It tied up our colleagues. All security services need informers, but there were too many of them. We were too worried about what might happen. We should have trusted people more.
What is your reaction to the attempt to reconstruct the documents that were torn up now?
That's absolute nonsense. There's nothing more to expect from them. Everything important is already known. That's a key thesis of this current approach to history, that if we keep digging, we'll find something.
Back at the former Stasi HQ at Normannenstrasse, Gotthold Schramm's old office, I found another extraordinary example of how the Stasi legacy is being brought to life. So I've come now into a room in the former Stasi headquarters where a lot of archive material is kept. And it's not just written archive material, but actually what was left behind here included lots of sound material, around 26,000 recordings they found here, made by the Ministry for State Security. And in this room here, there's various kinds of tape recorders, machines, computers, with which they've been trying to analyse this material and catalogue this material as part of what came from the Stasi. And with me is the head of this archive, Katrin Jurichs, and one of the technical specialists here, Dirk Ulrich. Now you've got some examples here of the work that you've been doing. Tell us what we've got here.
Okay. In 20 Minuten hier fertig, denke ich mir. Ja, komm ich nochmal vorbei. Ja?
Zwei Stasi-Mitarbeiter haben...
So what we're listening to is a recording of two Stasi operators trying to install a bug in a room, but they hadn't realised that a bug had already been installed in the room, so they're being listened to, and that's why we have the recording now.
Und dabei haben sie eine Blumenvase zerstört.
And breaking a vase while they do it.
Stasi controlling ihre eigenen Mitarbeiter. Ja, also.
So it's the Stasi listening in to their own colleagues, didn't trust their own colleagues. And then, from the bizarre to the traumatic. They played me a recording made by the Stasi of a secret 1950s trial for espionage in which the ranting judge builds up to pronouncing a death sentence against a woman defendant.
Gegen die Angeklagte, Frau Chadis, Elli Helene, geboren am 7.1.1912, die Todesstrafe. Den Angeklagten ist das Vermögen einzuziehen.
Hier ist sehr deutlich die Sprach- und Sprechweise.
What's extraordinary about that extract, you hear the aggressive language of the prosecutor talking about treachery, and it's reminiscent of the Nazi prosecutor Freisler, the way he used to speak in trials. But it's so emotional. You hear the reaction of the woman as she's condemned to death, and it really makes my hair stand on end. After listening to that recording, you wonder how the trauma of the East German secret police state can ever be overcome. But then, in another part of the former Stasi HQ, a final encounter makes me realise that some are finding a way. Katrin Beer cheerfully welcomes me to her office, where she runs an agency helping the victims of forced adoption in East Germany. Children were taken away from their parents because the parents had offended the all-powerful communist state. Katrin was just 4.5 years old when the Stasi came for her mother.
We lived in a flat, and they knocked very loudly in the morning. It was still dark. For a child, it was shocking. It was so loud, with deep male voices. It was terrible. We had to get dressed quickly. When my mother unlocked the door, they tore it open. We were taken down a narrow street to the market square, where we were separated. It was really tough. My mother promised she'd see us in the evening. She'd had to go to the Stasi for questioning before, and had been allowed back in the evening because she had small children. I don't think even she knew what was going on.
When did you see your mother again?
That happened in 1972, and 19 years later, after the fall of the wall, we found each other again in 1991.
And how were you able to discover exactly what had happened and why it had happened?
I grew up with a completely false story. I was told that my mother had been with lots of men, that she'd been too lazy to work. But when I met her again, I heard a different story. She'd wanted to go to the West ever since she was a teenager because she had 2 older sisters already living there. And later I read in the files of the youth services that shortly before her arrest, my mother had said if things carried on like this, she would clear off.
Is it very strange then for you now to be working in an office here in what was the Stasi headquarters, but working with victims of the Stasi in many cases?
When victims ring me up and I tell them where I am, they go, "Oh." I try to persuade them to see it differently. I tell them, earlier they sat here, now we're here. We're now sitting here. I think that's great.
Plainclothes Stasi.
Wir sitzen jetzt hier. Das ist doch klasse.
Just heading out now through the echoing corridors of the old Stasi headquarters, that conversation with Catherine Beer really sticks in my mind, the image of a 4.5-year-old girl having to watch as plainclothes Stasi men take her mother away, and she doesn't see her for another 19 years. But at the same time, a kind of feeling of mischievous triumph on her face when she talks about the fact that she now works from an office in what was this Stasi headquarters. We're now here, she says. They were there, but we're now here. And all the weight of that history, these files that are just in a couple of buildings just along from here, is being worked through. It's very intimidating, it's full of human misery, but at the same time there's a real feeling of satisfaction from those who look at these files and feel that the information they get from them is doing something to overcome that very heavy weight of history.
We hope you enjoyed this programme. You can find out more about Radio 4 downloads via our website. Visit bbc.co.uk/Radio4.